and a practicer of restorative and transformative justice with the Chosen Family Lawsuit located in New York City. In that capacity, they represent LGBTQ, polyamorous, multi-parent, and other non-traditional family units in a variety of proceedings. They are one of the recipients of the Best LGBTQ Attorneys Under 40 for the class of 2017, which is an award that was established by the LGBT Bar to recognize outstanding LGBTQ attorneys under the age of 40. They are also a member of the LGBTQI Family Professionals of New York, which works with New York families to resolve conflict without state intervention. They are the president of the National Lawyers Guild chapter of New York City. We're a big fan of the NLG in this room, so very excited about that. And finally, they are a member of the Selective Family Law Institute of the National LGBT Bar Association, as well as a member of the Family and Matrimonial Law Committee of the LGBT Bar Association of Greater New York. So I'll let Andy talk a little bit more about what the Chosen Family Law Center is and the kind of work that they do in New York City. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. You all hear me okay? Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction. Like Casey said, I'm legal director at the Chosen Family Law Center. I also do 500 million other things and sleep 4 times a year. But what that means is that I work on the edge of what family law is and how it understands itself, with families that don't look or work the way the law assumes families should. So that means that a lot of the things that you get taught about family law and about families culturally, legally, and emotionally don't apply and have to be sort of reimagined in order to be able to do this work. That's what I want to talk about today real quick. The important thing that I think is really easy to forget is that we get taught a lot of stories living in the world that we live in about what's the correct way to live and what a family should look like and what a man or a woman should look like and what sort of relationships that you should be in. And one of the fundamental ideas that underlies all of the different practices I do is about questioning those stories, imagining that maybe they're being taught to us not because they're true, but because they're useful. And if that's the case, useful to whom? So I want you to keep that in mind while we talk about family law from a professional and also from a cultural standpoint. So the idea of the family, right? We're talking about this on a large scale as a legal term, as a cultural artifact, as a complex idea with a complex history that often gets erased and revised. There are a million different things we could mean when we say the word family, and all of those different definitions are informed by different values, different desires, and different understandings of the world. So since a lot of you are in the legal field, let's start with the legal definition of family, the one single definition that encompasses family in all of the fields of law. In fact, there is none. There's no single legal definition of family. There's a lot of different ones. They don't agree with each other. There's no way of knowing how we are intended to reconcile them. It's a complicated and foolish patchwork that's based in the ways in which the legal system of this country were kind of put together with peanut butter and spit. So the census says that a family includes a householder and one or more people living in the same household who are related to the householder by birth, marriage, or adoption. In Greece, for example, their statistics bureau says everyone who lives under one roof is counted as a family. In the Netherlands, it's a social unit where one or more children are being cared for or brought up. A lot of state definitions, because they're on the older side, include servants of a household in the definition of the family. In some states, it is about the occupants of a dwelling unit. In some states, it's about functioning together as an integrated economic unit. But legally speaking, There's really no such thing as one understanding of a family. So then if we bring in the cultural understanding, the cultural definition, there's some sort of understandings that are enforced hegemonically that are pretty narrow. So when I say hegemonically, I mean, what are the rules that you spend your whole life getting taught that are embedded in the media that you consume and in the way that everything is set up, what relationships are allowed to be recognized, all of that stuff. That's what I mean when I say hegemonically enforced. The hegemonically enforced definition of a family is pretty narrow. If you think about culturally, who has a recognized right to live together, to share resources and things like health insurance, what does that family look like? It's probably two adults of two different genders who are married to one another, who are living with children that are biologically related to both of them and with nobody else. So that unit, what we call the nuclear family, that gets taught to us as the traditional and correct and best shape of the family. And all of the legal tools that currently exist are set up to support that kind of family relationship, the kind that's dyadic, meaning two people, the kind that's marital, where they have that recognition from the state. And also relevantly, relationships that everyone involved understands are predicated on a sexual and romantic relationship, but whose primary defining feature is that the relationship is a closed dyad. Because of this, any deviation from this model, which deviation, it is important to note, tends to correlate with other areas of marginalization along the axes of race, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, gender identity. That deviation is penalized by the restriction of access to the rights and benefits that are usually associated with recognized and legible family relationships. So the narrative of this restriction is that people who aren't living in this way are doing something wrong. They're doing something antisocial, because the nuclear family is, according to the hegemonically enforced norms, right and good, and that if you're living the way you're supposed to live, then your reward for doing that is a happy life and the attendant societal benefits like financial stability, healthcare, stable connections to your family members, social standing, all of that stuff that gets culturally attached on to the nuclear family, the marital family. The thing that we're supposed to be understanding is the normal family. So the dyadic model, or the marital model, is not actually the historical traditional norm from which people are recently starting to deviate. Rather, that model that's been taught to us as traditional and ideal, that model that's embedded in both our culture and our law, is actually neither traditional nor ideal. So we spend our whole lives, in America at least, being taught that this is the right way to live, traditional way to live, that it's generalizable to all of humanity, and that this is the way that it is and that it has always been, and the way that's sanctioned by both state and church. We spend our whole lives soaking in the idea that the two categories of family that exist are like this and wrong. And none of those things are actually true. This model of nuclear family that's based around marriage and the cultivation of biological offspring, the romantic partnership, all of that, that model is only about 100 years old. And it actually describes in real life fewer than half of American families. And worldwide, it's actually a lot less than that. That story is created by powerful systems like white supremacy, misogyny, and capitalism. It's imposed on us for a reason, and it's imposed on the wide diversity of what families look like globally through imperialism and violence. So it's a little bit like gender. Like, you know how the gender binary was imposed worldwide by colonialism and white supremacist violence, so too was the model of the nuclear family. The story positions itself, like binary gender, by the way, as deriving its authority from tradition and from nature. But in fact, it's a new story, a story that was constructed and spread intentionally, and with good reason. But it's a story that we don't have to believe or buy into, especially not as practitioners of the family law of the year 2020. So what would happen then if we opened up our understanding of what a family is and we tried to sort of get in there and clean out all of the hierarchy and ahistoricity and racist enculturation, um, and see what's left? What is the fundamental substance of the family that makes up the family? So what if we throw out all of these rules that have been put on us and imagine instead that the things that we and our clients are told that we're supposed to want for our lives aren't necessarily what's right for us or them. And it's not because our clients are wrong or broken, but because those stories are simple and people are complex. So if we strip away everything that we spend our lives being taught about what is supposed to make people happy, what kind of connections do people actually need to thrive? And start with your clients and with yourselves from the ground up. What do you want your family to be? So in this work, we talk about desire, we talk about human connection, and we talk about collaborative creation. We know that there are as many shapes of families as there are families in the world. And in the day-to-day, we work with the abundance of commonalities and differentiations that make that truth really cool and interesting. So we work with clients to say, what do you want to build? What structures will allow you to thrive? And how do you and the people that are your family plan to build it together? What promises do you want to make to each other about the future? How do you reduce your dependence on the state by building sustainable community networks that support you now and will support you throughout your lives? And how do you build it in a way that's flexible, that's resilient, and that's sustainable? So when we're talking about human connection, there's a ton of different ways that humans can be connected to each other. Romantically, sexually, living together, raising children together, working together, owning property together, being responsible for each other's healthcare or what happens to each other's stuff if someone were to get hurt or sick, being financially interdependent, having a bank account together, emigrating to live with each other, and so many more. There are also inter and intra-generational connections that go between members of the same generation and members of different generations that implicate different kinds of mutual care. So these connections on the legal level are the practical manifestations of the intimacies and commitments that make up the relationships that people build throughout their lives. They're the way family members demonstrate that they intend to be there for one another. So marriage, when we think of marriage as a legal entity, it's made of these connections, but specifically it's a giant lump of all of these connections stuck inseparably together and all on one person. There's over 1,000 rights, benefits, and connections. The assumption that you want to have every single one of those with the same person. So that assumption is based on that narrative of the heterosexual monogamous dyadic pair who meet all of one another's needs, who co-parent children who are biologically related to both of them, who are economically stable and operate as a nuclear unit, and the members of which fulfill the entirety of one another's practical, financial, and emotional needs. So at CFLC, the Chosen Family Law Center, the work that we do is about disentangling those connections from one another so that people can build their relationships out of the kinds of connections that they actually want to have, that actually benefit their families, their lives, and their abilities to thrive, instead of just getting it all together and assuming that's what everybody wants. You might have noticed, by the way, that in the last few years, there's been sort of an upswing in publicity about non-traditional or non-dyadic or polyamorous relationships and family diversity. I think this is attributable to a lot of things, including increased communication and access to community through technology, assisted in advances in assisted reproductive technology, and various economic events that have made it difficult for a greater number of families to access the sort of American dream model of economically stable nuclear families that they would otherwise have been able to access. But the really important thing to remember here is that while the publicity and the dialogue is new, family diversity is not. This is not something that is just coming out of the woodwork that no one has ever done before. This is a lens being brought to bear on something that has always existed. So I got asked the other day, I was at sort of a dinner party and someone said, hey, you're a lawyer, what's your favorite law? And I was like, listen, law school, one of the problems, one of the things that it leaves you with is an inability to tell what's interesting to non-lawyers. But I will tell you, if you actually want to know, what my favorite housing court case is. And I think it might just have been because they were a little tipsy, but they said they did want to know. So I told them about my favorite housing court case, which is from 1989, and it's called Braschi versus Stahl. And it's actually a case that significantly impacted what I made my career. And I try to infuse the ideas from this case through most of the work that I do. So again, this is Braschi versus Stahl. This is from 1989. And the plaintiff was a gay man, Miguel Braschi. He'd been living with his partner in his partner's rent control apartment for about a decade. Now, I know y'all aren't in New York, so you might not have quite the same rent control situation there as we do. But in New York, rent controlled leases can only be passed to family members. So if you are a family member and the leaseholder dies, you can keep the rent-controlled lease, which means it's a much lower rent. And if you are not a family member, then you don't get to keep the rent-controlled lease, so your housing costs are going to skyrocket. So there was, during the late 80s, during the AIDS crisis, there was this rash of the leaseholding partner of a pair of cohabitating men. The leaseholding partner would die, and then because legally the non-leaseholding but living in the apartment partner wasn't legally recognized as family, he wouldn't be able to keep the lease. And so all of these men all at once, their partner would die and then they would be kicked out of their house in the course of a couple of days. And it happened a lot. So there's one case, Braschi, where they fought it and they won. So this was, by the way, years before same-sex marriage was a twinkle in anybody's eye. But Mr. Braschi, Miguel Braschi, was arguing when his partner passed away that the rent-controlled lease should pass to him as a member of his partner's family. So the court agreed in the outcome of this case that the relationship between Miguel Braschi and his partner did count as family, even though it lacked governmental validation, and it laid out a test for what counts as family. It defined family as characterized by long-lasting relationships with emotional and financial commitment and interdependence, focused around providing caretaking for those who need it, including infants or the elderly, sharing resources, and building a life of mutual love and support. The ruling prioritized indicia of permanence, continuity, and reliance upon one another for daily family services over government recognition, and said, quote, family should not be restricted to those who have formalized their relationship by obtaining, for example, marriage certificate or an adoption order. These intended protections should not rest on fictitious legal distinctions or genetic history, but instead should find its foundation in the reality of family life. Now, again, this was 1989. How far backwards we've come, right? So this is the case, this is the ruling that I think about when I'm setting up family structures for clients and family members. I let that be my legal guidance, the reality of family life, building a life of mutual love and support, right? So that's a lot of nice sentiment, but what are we talking about practically? So there's no one thing that a family that deviates from the hegemonic dyadic norm looks like. It looks like a million things. They're partial or complete unbundling of all the different types of relationships in every possible permutation. It can be a polyamorous relationship network. It can be co-parenting, group parenting, co-housing in intentional communities, extended family network and collectives. It can be a lot of different things. So there isn't one way of serving them. But there is one way not to serve them, which is to try to squish them into marriage-type relationships and just disregard everything that can fit. Instead, serving these families requires creative and practical support for clients' autonomy and intention in what they want to create. So one distinction that I find really important in doing this work is the distinction between intra and extra-familial work. Intrafamilial work is the work of talking through a family's promises, commitments, and agreements within the relationship that make up the family. What are they trusting each other to do? What are the ways that they have each other's backs? This is a type of work that often results in writing up an agreement or a contract. The extrafamilial work is a separate area of work. It's about engaging with the structures, institutions, and entities that the family unit has to interact with as it moves through the world, and doing everything you can as a practitioner to render those relationships as legible to those institutions as they need to be. So let's say, for example, that you're working with people who are trying to co-parent in a group of, let's say, 5. So what are the components of parenting for these parents? What makes up a parent-child relationship in the reality of daily family life? So that's the first step, working with the parents to work out the reality of their daily family life. How are we collectively providing for these children? Where are they going to sleep every night? How will we ensure that the children don't lose access to someone they consider their parent, even if one of the adult relationships dissolves? Planning for the future, but within the family unit, right? Making plans for who's going to pick the kids up at school on which day, who's going to pay for what. Those are the intrafamilial steps. The second step is to look at how those family relationships move through the world, what the legal relationships between all the parties look like, and how they can be crafted in such a way that allows the parents to co-parent in the way that they intend. So we talk about who's going to pick the kids up at school, and then we talk about how do we make sure the school will permit that? Who's responsible for their health insurance costs, and how do we make sure that they can get that coverage? How do we plan for traveling with the parents and the children, and how do we reduce the risk when they're crossing borders and interacting with the state in that way? So we're talking about cobbling together the legal security for non-dyadic relationships, the legal security that is automatically granted to married couples. So we're using tools that will secure things like healthcare decision-making power, parentage and parental rights, estate rights using wills and advance directives, financial interdependence, and future planning. So these are 2 very different types of work, but they have to go hand in hand. So if you do extrafamilial work without the intrafamilial work, then you end up by default accepting the family structures that are offered without giving the clients to tell you what they actually want to build. If you do intrafamilial work without extrafamilial work, you're making these beautiful utopian plans for your chosen family with no mechanism for implementing them in an unfriendly world. So a big part of this is about being realistic with your clients about the impact of the work. Intrafamilial work in many cases means contracts that are only questionably enforceable. And in contract law, we're sort of taught that enforceability is the primary point of a contract. That's not what we're doing here. So this doesn't mean they're questionable enforceability, doesn't mean they're not useful, but rather that the goal is different. That in fact, what we're trying to accomplish with these contracts is facilitating important conversations that otherwise might not happen. The question of whether or not a co-parenting agreement would be enforceable by a court only comes up after a series of other things have already gone wrong. So a big part of what we're doing in these contracts is trying to make sure that these contracts never see a courthouse because they have enough dispute resolution work within them and enough future planning contained within them that it never actually has to happen. We consider doing these negotiations a gift that our clients are giving to their future selves, figuring out all of these hard things, considering challenges now when everything's fine, nobody's in crisis, and everybody's stupid in love with each other, rather than later when something's already gone wrong, and creating enough commonality of intention to make it unlikely that they'll ever be in the kind of conflict that ends up in court. Now, obviously, every new happy couple thinks that they're never going to end up in court, and they're mostly wrong. But what we do is we create structures for dispute resolution within the contract itself so that when they find themselves falling out of alignment, they have tools for it instead of panicking and trying to get the state involved. So all of this means that if your family doesn't fit an existing blueprint of what a family should look like, you don't get to take the shortcuts that everyone else gets to take. But in the long run, that's a good thing. It's like how it takes longer to get a suit made to measure than to buy one off the rack. But it'll also fit you better because it's made for you precisely. So thinking about what make sense for this family, and what contributions are within each individual's capacity to give, and what distributions will fill their needs. But communist, that's because it is. So when I go to work every day, I think about Brashi, and I think about the judge that family was about interdependence and mutual care, and not legal fictions like marriage licenses and adoption certificates. And I think about if there was a parallel universe where that forked off in 1989, where after Brashi, instead of what our movement did, which was say, forget that, we want to get married, and spent the last 30 years fighting for marriage rights, if instead we grabbed onto that legal reasoning and fought for the kind of legal recognition of family diversity that would be based on the idea that your family is who is there for you. When I think about what our movement would look like today after 30 years of working with that, that's the universe that I want our work to build. A universe where instead of fighting for inclusion in the privileged class that deserves access to rights and benefits, instead we're working to unsilo those rights and benefits and make them widely available. A movement that fights for the liberation of the more vulnerable members rather than the advancement of the least. So I think about my job as trying to push our universe a little bit closer to that one. So I know we started a little bit late. If we have time and anyone has a question, I'm happy to stay a little longer. But I know we're a little over time, and I don't want to delay everything else. I think you're on mute over there. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you may have to turn on your microphone. If someone is speaking, I'm afraid I don't have any audio.
Okay, no audio from us. Oh.
Now I can hear you.
Oh, okay, cool. Sorry, Andy, the only question was looking for a citation to the case that you were referencing, but we got it sorted out.
Okay, great.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I hope the rest of your symposium goes great.
Awesome.